Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Stedman podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about the topic of church ghosting. And if you are unfamiliar with that topic, it's basically if you happen to, maybe you're someone who had left your church for whatever the reason may be, and the people at that church that you've attended for a number of years just don't reach out and contact you, don't check on you, or whatever the case may be. So we're going to kind of talk about that and maybe some of the reasons why there is some ghosting. But joining me is Micah Current. Micah, how you doing, man?
Good now that you pressed the record button.
Yes, we kind of recorded about a good portion of this episode, and I forgot to hit the record button. So we're going to try to get back on track. But as far as Stories Gone Wild, this has just been a weird week, Micah. I just had a lot going on. And not only that, with the different ministries we had going on at the church today, this past week, we had a couple staff members who were out sick. And to kind of top everything off, we also had a group. It's an Ethiopian church that's meeting at our church, and they had their big celebration. And they were at the church on Saturday at like 2:30 in the morning, and they ended up, and I left to go help make some youth cookies for our youth cookie fundraiser at about 2:30, and there were still cars in the parking lot from this event. So from 2:30 to like a little bit past 2:30, like literally 2:30 to 2:30, there were still people at the church for this big kind of church plant with the Ethiopian Orthodox Church that's been meeting at our church. So it's been a exhausting day, an exhausting week this week. I'm hoping to maybe take some time off to recover, but it is Advent, and sometimes it's hard to find time to recover when there's so much stuff to do before their big Christmas Eve services. So that's kind of like my Story's Gone Wild, just busy Advent season. So Micah, what Story's Gone Wild do you have one to share with us?
I do. That's another thing that, we've not really talked about on your show, but kind of like I guess the responsibility of hosting, being on staff at a church, like whether it's hosting another church that's using your space, whether it's a wedding, whether it's a funeral, whether it's, Boy Scouts or, those things like that the church hosts. And Scott, you and I've been there, and, you have to be at the church to open it and be there to close it, and kind of just sit there and not really be involved in the event per se, but make sure that you're there in case people have questions. Why isn't this light working? Hey, can you turn this microphone on for me? Hey, you know, can we use your kitchen? Like XYZ. Those are, when you said that, I thought about that, and I'm like, wow, that's another episode that we could do and certainly talk about, in the future, as far as hosting, as a church, being a host for, various events. But for my Story's Gone Wild, in the season of Advent, I was thinking about a story about 10 years ago when I had a parishioner that wasn't very happy with me. Um, and I was young and was just ambitious about planning my first Advent as a creative arts pastor. And I had planned, pretty much the entire month of December, all of our services, and basically the way that I do worship in respect to Christmas is that probably the first Sunday after Thanksgiving, which is the first Sunday of Advent. I usually do one Christmas song, kind of as a teaser, do three worship songs of our catalog, normal songs that we are normally doing. And in week two, we do two Christmas songs and two worship songs, and then three Christmas songs and one worship song. And by the time we get to Christmas Eve and Christmas Sunday, we're doing all Christmas music. It kind of builds anticipation, and it builds momentum as we head towards Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. And so that's kind of my philosophy of Christmas worship planning. And so we talk a lot of times as pastors and leaders of churches about sacred cows. And for those who are listening who don't know about sacred cows, Sacred cows are basically things within the church that people hold on to, or people don't want changed, right? It could be something in the church, like physically, that, I don't want that moved. I've always been in charge of this. Um, every pastor's always used that pulpit. Um, don't move the communion table 2 inches to the left, XYZ. And so um, this is my first pastorate out of seminary. And um, one of our vocalists reached out to me, after church on Sunday, and was like, "Hey, can I meet you Wednesday before practice?" And I was like, "Sure." And I thought maybe, hey, she wants to serve more. She may want to serve less. She wants to be more involved. I didn't really know what to expect in this meeting. So I'm sitting in my office Wednesday before practice, and she she rolls in and shuts the door and proceeds to yell at me for 45 minutes to an hour about handbells. And for those of you that don't know what handbells are, they're literally just bells that you play with your hands, and you ring them and you play a melody, and you have a group of folks, and every bell is a different note, and you read sheet music, and you can play different songs and based on the rhythm and the melody of the music. So little to my knowledge, this church had had a handbell choir for years, and I had no idea that they had one. But the biggest thing was that they really didn't use the handbell choir except for Christmas.
Mm.
And so, knowing full well that I had not planned anything for the handbell choir, this parishioner came in and gave me a piece of her mind and said, "How dare you not include the handbell choir?" And I was like, "Listen, I'm so sorry that you're upset." And the ironic piece was she wasn't really in charge of it. She was just involved with it. And so there was another lady who had been in the church for years who had directed it. And I was like, "Listen, if you guys want to do this, we can certainly find time." And the long and the short of it is that we were able to work something out, um, where I should say the handbell choir, was able to play a couple of Sundays before church started, during the offering a couple of weeks, and then during Christmas Eve they did like a full set before the Christmas Eve service started. And when you and I were recording earlier, or tried to record, and we didn't press the record button, it was one of the things that I said. One of the things that I said to you, offline, was that, like, that's not something that you get prepared for.
No, no.
That your teachers, faculty, staff, seminary, Bible college, they don't prepare you for those kind of conflicts when you walk out of seminary or ordination or whatever, when you go to pastor your first church, when somebody comes in your office and screams at you for 45 minutes to an hour. Like, they just don't prepare you for those things. So,
Mhm.
yeah, in the spirit of Advent, that was my first that was my first Advent, as a worship pastor, as a full-time worship
Wow.
pastor. So that was my story's gone wild.
Yeah. So, oh goodness. So that's wild. And it's just a shame, like you said, like they don't prepare that stuff for you. Not even in like seminary or Bible college, but even like when you're going through the ordination process, they want to, at least when I went through my ordination process, it was more of like, okay, do you believe what our denomination believes? Here's how you do a funeral. Here's how you write a sermon. Here's how you do a wedding. Here's some of the things to be thinking about: baptisms, communion,
Did they
all
did they
the.
show you that stuff? I know it's a little off topic, but did they talk about that stuff with you while you were going through ordination, or no?
Yeah.
Okay,
About what stuff? I'm sorry,
like,
like
just
the
like getting weddings,
Yeah.
funerals, that kind of
Oh
stuff.
yeah, yeah. My mentoring pastor, we went through all that. We went through all that. Even like I said, like, hey, here's like a book, because I know there's like some books out there that have like little examples that can kind of help you. I know when I did my internship, I got one from the pastor whose church I was interning at, and it was like everything was in KJV. And I was like, okay, like, I mean, it had good stuff, but basically it was like, okay, and no one talks like this. So, like, who am I doing this wedding for, like the 17th century? Like, hey, hey, wedding time, wedding thy times. So, anyway,
Well, the reason that I asked, though, is that, like, your ordination process was vastly different from mine.
Yeah, because I did my whole ordination process before
Leadership focus was the thing.
leadership focus was a thing. So yeah. Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about church ghosting, and like I said at the earlier of at this episode, is that it's basically, a church that maybe one attended for maybe many years, and then you decide to move, and for an example, let's just say you move because you move on from the church because maybe you physically moved to a different city, or maybe you moved over on the other side of town, and it doesn't make sense to drive 45 minutes to go to a church. So you decide to go look elsewhere. Everything's amicable, everything's good. But then after you leave that church, you notice that, hey, no one from the church talks to us. No one from the church hangs out from us. Some of the kids that would play with the other kids at church, like, they're not inviting us to birthday parties anymore. And it's almost like you kind of get shunned or ghosted, or it's almost like once you left that church, and the church, a lot of people say, well, the church is kind of like a family. We encourage each other, we build one another up. We're all part of this, universal church. And all of a sudden, it's like there's no contact from any of those people who you used to hang out with. Whether that would be the pastor or whether that would just be a regular lay person in the church. So Micah, I know you kind of have a different experience just being not only a worship leader, but also being a pastor's kid. Like, have you ever experienced any form of ghosting in your any of the churches that you've attended in your lifetime?
Yeah, I think. Well, first, let me say that, like, before I get into the ghosting thing, but like, I have also had really good relationships where I have, still been in contact with people, the different churches that I've been a part of or worked at, even to this day. Right. So there's still there are good relationships that come out of this, right? But certainly the one of the thoughts that comes to mind is, like, there was a church that my dad was pastoring when, we were young children, and I don't really know the circumstances that happened, but we were really close with this family, and um, they had a son that was about my age and a daughter who's a little bit older than us, and we all hung out together. And stayed at their house, he stayed at my house. We played video games. We both loved professional wrestling. Um, you know, was all the time talking about wrestling. And when we were at the church together, we were inseparable. When we were going out to eat, we were inseparable. So we were really good friends when we had moved to this. When we had moved to this area, and my dad took over this church. And I think it was like our first or second year that he was there, and we did the annual business meeting. And the parents of this family got really upset with something that happened in the business meeting. And so they yelled and they screamed and they stormed out of the church, and we never heard from him again. So not only did they leave the church, there went my best friend from the church. And so, I mean, your kids could probably speak into this. I mean, I know they're young, but like, there's probably some similar circumstances there. But like, I think of being a pastor's kid where that's happened, where people have come to the church, they've left because they've been mad or upset, and you never hear from them again. And I just thought it was super awkward, because here one day I have this really good friend, and then the next day I don't. And it's because I have um it had nothing to do with me, and it had nothing to do with him. It had everything to do with the parents getting upset at something that happened at the church, and they weren't happy with it, so they left the church. Um,
Mm.
Another light to look through that in is that, people move, people relocate, people get new jobs, and that's totally common. But it still doesn't mean that it doesn't hurt when you have friends who move, right? Like, if you have really good friends and they they leave. But I think in those circumstances, especially with today's technology. You can FaceTime people, you can text people, you can um, jump online and play a video game with a friend. You can,
Hmm.
there are many ways to connect these days, social media, etc. Um, one of the things that I've noticed as a pastor, whether it's I've left on good terms, bad terms, neutral terms of leaving a position, my favorite line is, "We'll stay in touch," and then you don't hear from them at all. And there was a church I was at not too long ago, and it was, I wasn't there very long at all, but like they were like, thank you for everything, man. We really appreciate everything you've got us through during the COVID period. And we just, we couldn't have done it without you. We'll stay in touch. And I've not heard from any,
Mm.
right? And so and I wasn't expecting to, right? And another example I think is that I've been in a ministry assignment and I've left and I haven't left on the best of terms. And I've reached out to the pastor and apologized and try to mend those fences. And then we go through that reconciliation process and you think that things are going to be somewhat normal again, and then nothing. So those are a couple of examples. What about you?
Yeah, so it's been interesting because when I was, the church I grew up in, when I left to go to college, like they were still very good at contacting people. Like I know, there'd be times where I go and check my mail and I get a card from it was called the Ministry of Care and Encouragement. And I just get a card from people saying, "Hey, we're praying for you. Hope you're having a great start to your school." Sometimes I may get a care package. Um, and then, of course, when I would come back, still good at it. Even after I kind of left the church because I was going and pastoring at other churches and kind of off on my own ministry, like I would still have some people that would reach out and talk with me and kind of just check to see how I was doing. Um, but as far as ghosting, like it's one of those things where, especially as a pastor, it's a lot different because in some ways, I there's an example where there were people who, for whatever reason, just kind of left the church because of me. For whatever reason, they didn't like kind of like my ministry style or how I was preaching, or whatever the case may have been. Um, but there was times like they had some relations with people within the church still. So occasionally when we'd have like children's events or church events, they'd show up, and I was very good at like just contacting them, encouraging them. If I found out that one of their loved ones was sick, I'd say, "Hey, I heard that, your dad or your husband or your wife is sick. Just letting you know I'm praying for you guys." And it was just always kind and considerate. And it got to the point where one of the people who left after about a couple years started to come back and one of the reasons why they said they came back was because, you know, I truly felt that Pastor Scott actually cared about me. And anytime when I showed up, he was the first one to say hi to me, the first one to greet, check how I was doing, and everything else. And that was kind of that. However, there have been times where I have had people say that they have left the church, and even, and one of the reasons why they left the church is because they left because of whatever, but then they were shocked that sometimes, you know, the pastor seems like to be the only person who may be reaching out, if that. But it seemed like the rest of the people who, I'm actually doing life with just don't seem to reach out to me. So that's been hard. The few
Well, it's
times
also
I've left.
it's also hard as a pastor, Scott. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but like,
Well, no, you're fine.
you've been a lead pastor before. It's also hard not to take that extremely hard or personal because people leave the church and you automatically think it's because of you. Or
Yeah.
you can take it, you can feel like you're taking the blame because XYZ has left the church and they're mad at you, but it's like, well, maybe they're not mad at you. Maybe they're mad at somebody else or mad at the circumstances. But it's hard
Yeah.
for you as the lead pastor of a church not to take that extremely hard or personal.
Well, and I don't necessarily. I mean, I think it's kind of like a double-edged sword. So if someone
Hmm.
leaves the church, I think as a leader, you kind of blame yourself, like, oh, well, they left because they don't like my preaching, or they don't like the way I do ministry, or whatever the case may be. Especially if you're a pastor and you kind of reach out and saying, hey, we just want to kind of know why you left. I just want to check on you, just make sure. Or even if they didn't say they're leaving, you just notice like, hey, it's been a couple Sundays, they didn't show up. What's going on? So you reach out to them, and then and you may not even get a call back. So you automatically think, oh, it's me. But then when there's other people in the church and they're like, hey, why did so and so leave, this family leave, and they automatically assume, well, it had to be because of the pastor. And so sometimes there's the other pressure too, because they have pressure from the congregation, like, oh, are people leaving because of you?
Well, and then
Um,
rumors get started too,
and then
right?
rumors get started, and you got that whole toxicity that starts happening, and a lot of times, there's been times, and I especially, there's been times where I've dealt with people who don't come to church, and mainly because they're shut-ins. Like at this point, I'm talking about really your older church members who have been at that church for 30 plus years. They're at the point where they're just physically cannot get up and drive to church or get to church in person, so they're at home. And I could remember as a pastor doing visitations and would just talk to people, and a lot of times they would say, it's always great to see you, Pastor Scott, but I wish I could see people from the church.
Mm.
And I still remember a time where I was trying to get like a ministry team together to do visitations and get people to sign up, and literally there are people who said they would go and they visit people, but then they never did. And then there's some people who they would call or they would write a card, because they're not mobile as well, so that's the best they could do. I'm like, well, at least it's something. But then I just would get frustrated, because it's like, well, you're saying we would go visit these people, and yet anytime when I go and visit people, it's almost like they say, oh no, we haven't seen anyone from the church. So I think when you get older, it's hard too, because it's like, I've been at this church for 40 years, I'm still a member of this church, and yet I can't get anybody to see me. um but I was actually doing some exploring, because I'm like, oh, is this just like is this a similar situation? Because and I found a bunch of these stories, which I think is and there's been a lot of stories that people sharing, and this is just like a thread on Reddit, but that someone kind of commented, and here is this kind of the thing that people have said, like, in 25 years of attending the church, I had one person reach out to me after leaving. Pathetic. um I saw someone say, um
Let me take it a step
yeah,
further too.
go ahead. Yeah.
Like I'm thinking through like, well, you were talking earlier, like what, I know that the Church of God per se doesn't do membership. Like they believe that if you're saved and you come to our church, that we're a family, and that you're part of God's church and you're part of the body. What about churches that have actual membership?
Hmm.
Baptist churches. Does your
Yeah,
UMC have that?
we do
Like a
have
member?
like, so what we do is the UMC does have membership. And then and especially like when we get to the end of the year, a lot of times, the church staff or the pastor kind of look through all the church membership and notice people who haven't been attending for a while, or haven't attended at all this year. And then they kind of reach out to them and say, hey, we notice you haven't been attending, or your attendance has dropped. Like, we're just want to make sure we check on you, see if you're okay. But then also, hey, are you still a member of this church? Do you want us to, you know, not
keep sending
necessarily
you
kids.
stuff essentially,
Like, yeah,
like newsletters in the mail or invitations to thing in the mail,
or it
or
could be one of those things where they move to a different church within the United Methodist Church because they're going to a church that's closer, but they may not know how to transfer their membership from one church to the other church. And that's kind of, and I think that whole thing gets very convoluted as well. But in some ways, I think just on the surface, it's just like a good way of just trying to keep track with people every year. Hey, we notice we haven't seen these people in a while. Like, let's just kind of see, hey, what's going on. So, I mean, I think that's kind of what that is with membership.
well, I think because like you made a great point earlier, but like I don't know if I shared it on this podcast or not, but you know, a good friend of mine was a pastor at a church in Missouri, and when COVID happened, they they basically printed out a spreadsheet of all their members, and it was very early on in the pandemic when churches weren't meeting at all, but like they literally divided the spreadsheet amongst their staff and said, hey, you call these 60 people and I'm going to call these 60 people and you call these 60 people and just call them and see how they're doing and touch base with them. I don't think we do that enough.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that we don't have the bandwidth in smaller churches as pastors, like, some churches are very fortunate to have a larger staff and have a pastor who is, merely focused on connections and focus on, small groups and things like that, where um, you can constantly be in contact with folks. However, I think we do a huge disservice to people with not, connecting with them. I think of my job in Miami, every week at work within the division that I work in, we send out this newsletter, and it talks about all the events happening on, campus. It talks about all the news stories, the recent, events and the stories that have taken place within the college that I work at. And,
Mm-hmm.
it's a great way to stay connected with folks. And, social media is another great way to stay connected with folks, inviting them to church and talking about like sermon recaps,
Mm-hmm.
streaming, XYZ. I know that's a long tangent and a long answer, but
Yeah.
like I think, you talk about ghosting from the perspective of people leaving because they're mad, they're upset, or they get another job and they leave and they don't tell you, or they just stop coming to church
Yeah.
altogether. Like, are you reaching out?
Yeah.
Are you talking to these folks? Are you texting these people? Are you trying to connect with them to see if they even have an interest in this church anymore? If not, then at least right?
Yeah.
Like, I think we're doing this huge disservice as pastors and leaders when we're not reaching out to folks. And granted, I know that we're all tired and we're all worn out and we're all, um, you know, struggling to breathe as far as like we don't have just enough time or bandwidth in the day or within
Yeah.
our work weeks. And it's like, but still, I think that we need to do a better job of connecting with folks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and again, like I think, it also depends on the culture of the church. Like I'm reading through this list and like there's one where it was like it says, I left the church about 6 months ago, but still have friends from those spaces and other Christian friends who haven't been pushy about my own faith transition. I feel very fortunate to have those people because I know plenty more who haven't been like that. I think ultimately kind people are kind people, and religion isn't a good indicator for whether or not someone is kind. So basically saying, hey, I left the church 6 months ago. I still have people not only from that church, but even some of my Christian friends that still reach out and talk to me. They may be going through kind of a crisis of faith. At least that's what I'm kind of reading in between the lines. So, but there's still people who care and checking on them. There's one that says, for people that I only knew through church, no, I left in 2014 and it took until 2019. So this is pre-pandemic. This is pre-pandemic. So we can't even blame COVID-19 for this. But it was 5 years later for any of my mentors to reach out to see how I was doing. One admonished me in the comments. The cooler one DM'd me, and I chose not to respond because I was pretty horrified that it took that long. So I think that's interesting that, yeah, it took 5 years. And then one of my buddies who was a worship leader at a church in the Columbus area for many, many years, he was going and he got to a point where I think after COVID, like he was just probably burned out from the story he told me. So he decided, I think it's my time to kind of be done with leading worship. But his wife was also involved in doing children's ministry. So he kind of said like, hey, he told his wife to say, hey, I'm going to be done leading worship. I'm just kind of done at this point. I know you're still involved in children's ministry. And he kind of just said, if you still feel involved, if you still feel called to still continue to be involved in youth ministry, I'm going to support you. You can still do youth ministry. And, I'll just kind of take a backseat and still be a part of the church. I'll just kind of, sit in the back and not be up on stage. Well, then his wife kind of, just kind of had a couple more months because she was kind of like the lead head of all the children's ministry stuff at that church, even though she wasn't like technically staff. And, she just kind of got to the point where, she felt tired and she felt done too. So they both kind of were done with ministry and felt it was their time to leave that church and go see what the next ministry adventure was for them. So, they both kind of told the pastor that they're leaving, and the pastor was very genuine and said, "Oh, thank you so much for your hard work. We're really going to miss you guys, but totally understand, where you're coming from." And then at the end, it was their last Sunday, and they had like, the people that they were in a small group with, and they're coming up and they kind of said, "Well, I guess this is goodbye. And, we won't see you again." And my buddy's like, "Whoa, what? Like, no, like, just because we're leaving the church doesn't mean that we can't hang out anymore. Doesn't mean that that we can't like, I mean, like we're still planning on coming to small group. Like it's just, Sunday mornings, we're just kind of at a point where we're looking at different, but we love our small group and we would still like to be a part of it." But it was almost like, but I think even sometimes there's a cultural mentality that when someone leaves the church, it's almost like, if you have a healthy, good church, you almost kind of have like this view of like, well, we don't want to be too pushy and kind of, we want to give them space. We want to kind of give them the opportunity to do whatever, which I feel like, even though I understand the kindness and the thought process of that, I also feel that's kind of bad because maybe, yeah, they do want the space, but they still want to know if someone cares for them, if this church still loves them, even though they are taking a break or they're leaving or they're going to do a different ministry. But then there's other cases where you may have a church where, and I mean, just reading somewhere, it's like, "Oh, I left the church," and the pastor is basically telling the congregation that I was a sinner, that I was a devil worshiper, and to not have any contact with me. Like I left the church and I'm not supposed to talk to him. And if anybody, and even like, if anybody even reaches out to this person and the church found out about it, then they were going to get in trouble and they were probably going to be asked to leave the church as well. And I feel like in that situation, that's a very toxic situation when church leaders are basically saying, "Yeah, this person left. They're evil. They're not trustworthy. You should not contact them. You should not do anything with this person. And if we find out you're contacting this person or trying to find stuff out from them, then you're going to be kicked out of the church as well." And then, of course, there is one of the comments on here was very short. "They stalked me and tried to get me to testify against their favorite sexual abuser. Does that count?" Yikes. So, oh, hey, we're just reaching out so you don't sue us. Like, yeah. So I feel like,
Or
I mean,
I know we've talked a lot about like when you leave churches in a staff position. What were those things like non-compete or not non-compete?
oh yeah, non-disclosure agreements,
Yeah, NDAs.
NDAs.
It kind of feels like that.
Oh yeah, and I'm not surprised because and I feel like that's always kind of I feel like, and we talked about NDAs like a year ago. We talked about that. But I feel like when you have a church and you're leaving a church and you have to sign an NDA, it truly shows that they don't really, and this is my opinion, the church doesn't really care about you. They care more about their reputation and not getting sued versus, I really care about this person. They must have felt hurt by the church and we want to apologize. And this, it's like, no, you're going to sign this NDA and that's the end of that. Or we're gonna send you a cease and desist letter so you can't speak bad about the church or whatever the case may be. So I feel like that kind of shows a toxicity of the church. So I mean, I know it's like very broad, and we kind of hit on a couple of key points on why people kind of some people leave churches because of toxic churches, and the reason why people don't contact them because leadership's doing. The other time it's just probably pure negligence on the church's behalf because they feel like they're doing the right thing. And they're not really. And So I think kind of moving forward to like, what do you do? I think on the church side of things, like if someone leaves the church, always check with them, always contact them. And you have to remember that when they leave, they're also hurting as well. They may feel hurt, or maybe they just are burned out, and maybe they left because, I've been I've been a volunteer at this teaching Sunday school for 5 years, and I feel like not once has someone said, "Hey, I really appreciate the hard work that you're doing." I just feel like I got taken for granted. My work and my skill got taken for granted. And so they felt burned out and they left. Other people may felt like, hey, pastor's being a narcissistic individual, it's being controlling. So I left because it was getting too uncomfortable for me. So I feel like, if there's somebody that you have a relationship with and you notice they left the church, then, reach out to them, talk with them. And don't wait for like a year, or don't wait 5 years to finally reach out and go, hey, how you doing? Like, long time no see. Like actually kind of be engaged. And then, and at the end, if they say, hey, I just need space and I just need time to heal, give them their space. But, I think at first, that initial contact, just to figure out what they're going on, what they're feeling, and then kind of go from there. I think that's kind of a good thing. And I think for pastors, when people leave the church, I know sometimes it may be hard to follow up with them, especially if, but, all I say is, try to make the attempt, call them, leave a message on the phone. And if they don't get back to you, you did what you could. You don't need to constantly be, harping and calling them, but, and then if you see them again, if they happen to make an appearance at one of your church events or something, like I did, if I saw them, I was just like, hey, I'm so glad to see you. How are things? How's your family? How are you doing? And, just be genuine. I think that's kind of the big thing. If you really, truly care about people and care about the people in your church, and especially those who leave the church, if you truly care about them and value them as a person, you just need to reach out to them and check on them and just see how they're doing. I think that's going to speak volumes to anything. It may even be kind of a catalyst to kind of get them to come back to church, or at least attend a church. It may not be your own church, but at least maybe it kind of helps with the healing process in some ways. Final thoughts from you, Micah?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And as we kind of wrap it up, I kind of have there's a story that of a church recently that I know of and that I'm kind of connected with in the state of Florida. And this, and in my opinion, this is the right way to do things. A good friend of mine was looking for a creative arts worship pastor role, and he was in a situation where it wasn't super healthy, and so he wanted to transition out of that, but stay in worship, right? Stay into the worship circle and stay involved in leading worship. And he got connected with this other church, and their worship pastor at the time was feeling called to go plant a church in Florida, in the same area, kind of close to where they already were. And uh, what kind of happened was my friend ended up taking the creative arts pastor role over, and then the creative arts pastor who was feeling called to plant a church planted a church, and they basically celebrated the fact that he was going to go plant a church. And it's almost as if it's like a satellite church of
Mm-hmm.
this church without being a satellite church. They're partnering with this church to help them get off the ground and launch and do all these things. But um, they were very gracious in his departure. So much so that like the lead pastor of this church went and preached, I think the first week of, the first or second week after they launched the satellite campus, or, the other campus where this other guy felt called to plant a church. And in turn, they've had him come back and preach at the church that he left. And so like he left on very good terms, I guess is what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
And so like the people know him, they know his face. He was at this church for a long period of time. And, they sent a group of folks from that church to kind of, help get this other church off the ground and launched as they've planted the satellite. And even the worship pastor, my friend who took over, I think has led worship there. And he's come back to lead worship at this other church. I mean, it's like a super healthy like the way that things should be done, right? And so there was no ghosting on that part, and people weren't mad, and people actually celebrated the fact that he felt a call from God to go plant another church. And this church has done a great job of partnering with him, his family, and the plant where they've started this new church. So it's all that to say, I think that, like, yes, church ghosting is a thing, but it doesn't have to be a thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's going to do it for us. And I think that's kind of a good thing. So at the end of the day, just be kind, always continue to reach out to people and always be respectful, and you may think being respectful is just giving them space, but I think if you can make that initial contact and then give them space, I think that's going to go a long way than just assuming, well, they need space and I'm not going to reach out to them, because again, life gets so busy, and then maybe you might have the best intentions to maybe reach out to them a month or two after they have left, but then life happens and then it ends up being 5 years, and then you're like, oh, I should probably check on that person, and then at that point the damage had already been done. So friends, thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and we'll be back on next week with another episode. Take care.